we have Burt Kearns. Who is Burt Kearns? Producer, writer. I'm going to run it down, Burt. Producer, writer, director, TV, film, author. But what drew me to Burt was Brando. My guy Brando, he wrote the definitive. I've read them all. I thought, actually, I haven't read his yet, but what I heard on a different podcast in a galaxy long and far away that I won't mention, I don't want to give anybody else credit but myself, but this whole thing that I heard on this podcast, I said to myself, as I said to you before, Burt, I have to get this man on my program. And here you are. You probably got that note from me and said, who the heck is Ralph Romeo? And why the hell does he want me on his podcast? Well, you were good enough to come by, and I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Great to get the invitation.
And,
Marlon, Brando fan. That's great.
Oh, well, thank you, because radio is the greatest form of communication in my mind. And you don't have to dress up for radio. Well, now we're kind of presentable, but you can do a radio show in your pajamas. It's a beautiful thing.
That's right. I mean, Cousin Brucey still sounds like Cousin Brucey after all these years.
He's 86 or something like that.
Yeah.
And well, let's go to now. Marlon, the book is oh wait, now I have the title and I mislaid the title here because yeah. You say you give me your title.
It's Marlon Brando, Hollywood Rebel.
I was going to say Hollywood Rebel, but I wasn't sure if I was right. Marlon Brando, Hollywood Rebel. And does that tell the whole tale? I mean, was this guy the ultimate rebel?
Well, it seems that he was. I mean, when it came to writing this book, the question was, what else can you write about Marlon Brando? There's been so many books about the guy. Like you said, he wrote his own book. Peter Manso has got an 800-page Brando book. What else could be written about this man, the greatest actor, greatest screen actor of the 20th century, I would say. Well, it came down to the fact that in April marked Brando's 100th birthday. It's been 20 years since his death, 100 years since he was born. And I looked at how Brando has influenced not only acting and not only movies, but how he's influenced pop culture 100 years after his birth. And still today, there are so many, not only, Brando wannabes in acting and young Brandos and new Brandos, but he's influenced everything from, the fashion world to the art world to, motorcycle gangs and all sorts of pop culture. We can thank Brando for today.
And that very familiar picture, you mentioned motorcycle gangs. I think of the Wild One with him with that cap and just that menacing look on his face. Wasn't that beautiful?
Well, that was it. And it came down to the Wild One. It came down to me. I grew up in the 60s and I was a kid with the posters on my wall.
Sure.
And I had Peter Fonda from Easy Rider with the red, white, and blue gas tank. And it was a black and white poster and I colored it in. Yeah. And I also had, as everybody did, because you could buy it down at Woolworths for 99 cents, that picture of Brando from the Wild One. And that's who Brando was to me growing up. This was before The Godfather came out. I didn't really see Brando movies as a kid, but I always knew the Wild One, that motorcycle rebel. And as it turned out, that movie, it was his 5th film, wasn't his best picture, but it turns out to be probably the most influential when you look at the fact that just that image of Brando in that black leather jacket, riding that motorcycle. He influenced Elvis Presley. He influenced the Beatles. He influenced Andy Warhol. He influenced the Ramones. And I got to say this, you wouldn't have a Leatherman in the Village People if it wasn't for the Wild One. It was a direct.
That's pretty good. I didn't think of that one. You're so right. I'll tell you, as far as that film goes, to me as a connoisseur, not the greatest film on earth, as you mentioned, but the most influential, possibly.
Oh, most definitely.
When I saw that film for the first time, I was expecting something groundbreaking, breaking all norms. But I guess for the early 50s, that was groundbreaking.
Oh yeah, I mean this film when it came out, it was a biker picture. But Brando had done. He came out here in 1949, 1950. His first film was called The Men. He played a paraplegic war veteran in a hospital. Then he did the film version of A Streetcar Named Desire. Then he played the revolutionary Emiliano Zapata in Viva Zapata. After that, he was known as the mumbler. He was this, a realistic actor that people hadn't really seen before. He did Shakespeare. He played Mark Antony and Julius Caesar, and he was great in it. So how does he? And he's got 3 Academy Award nominations for Best Actor.
Yeah.
What does he do next? A biker flick. So the thing was, there was no such thing as biker flicks back then. Brando thought, and the producer thought, they were making a film of great social relevance. After World War II, a lot of guys came back from the war. This was the greatest generation, the silent generation. They had seen things they couldn't speak about. They'd seen horrific things, and they couldn't fit back into society. They couldn't fit back into that white picket fence world they came from. So what did they do? They got Harley Davidson motorcycles, the same type that they were riding in Europe. And they got in packs and they hit the road. And they were rowdy and they were drunk and they caused trouble. They started gangs. At the same time, after World War II, you had juvenile delinquency. Congress was talking about it, social groups. They're all worried about these gangs of kids. So this movie is going to tackle these 2 social issues. And Brando was really hot on that because he wanted to make movies that meant something. He wanted to make movies that made a difference. So what happens? They make this film. The censors get it immediately, say, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't say that." And in the end, you had The Wild One, which is basically about a motorcycle gang comes to a town, wreaks havoc. Another motorcycle comes, they fight, and there's sort of an overnight riot in this town, and then everybody gets sent on their way. And Brando was so disappointed. He said, "I really wanted to get to the root of this. I wanted to show why these kids and why these guys formed gangs, why they were violent. I wanted to show how society was the cause of it. Instead, we just showed the violence." So he moved on. He was very unhappy with the film. He had no idea that this film, because of when it came out and because of where it was positioned and because of his performance, it inspired a youth generation, a rock and roll generation when there was no rock and roll in the movie. And it helped it helped push along the civil rights movement, believe it or not. This film came out at the same time that the Supreme Court came down with its Brown versus Board of Education ruling, saying that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. And so the civil rights movement was just starting. And here you had Brando playing the leader of a gang called the Black Rebels Motorcycle Club, going into a town called Wrightsville, which you could say was Whitesville, going and causing all this trouble, talking in this hipster bebop lingo. Everybody glommed on to Brando as the symbol of all these movements. So you have this movie that winds up being influential, through today. I have to take a deep breath now. Sorry.
No, because you're enthusiastic about this. Why shouldn't you be? You wrote a marvelous book. But I remember his acting in that, very subdued. He could have screamed his way through the whole role, as most actors would, and tough guyed his way. But he was both feminine and masculine, which many people said that about him. And everybody else stuck out like that proverbial sore thumb because they weren't coming from within. The woman he played opposite in that film, who was that again?
Mary Murphy.
That's right. Her style was external. Her style was, she showed a lot, where Brando kept everything within. And it stuck out so strongly to me when I watched that film as a young guy. That's what the so-called method is. It's working from within. And Brando showed it in spades in that film.
Right. It was a real choice that he made to play a motorcycle gang leader like a 15-year-old kid who's scared of girls. I mean, he had this lisping voice, which later people picked up on and they called it a bisexual charisma.
Yeah.
If you look at the motorcycle gang leader who really did go on to influence the style and the attitude of the motorcycle gangs that came up in the 1960s was Lee Marvin, who played Chino, who played the opposing gang leader in the film. Sonny Barger, who became the face of the Hells Angels in the 1960s, brought it to Hollywood, made movies with Peter Fonda, etc. He said, "Nah, Brando wasn't the man. Lee Marvin was the guy that influenced us." In fact, Sonny Barger bought the jersey that Lee Marvin wore in the film at auction because Lee Marvin was the man as far as they were concerned. Brando had his whole own take on it, which wound up influencing motorcycle movies and influencing the culture, but then going far beyond that.
And
He really,
not to stay on this forever, but this film, it's funny how this came up first for whatever reason. Far from my favorite Brando film, I'm sure yours, but this one, for some reason, is the point of conversation here. I remember him packed into these dungarees, they would call them in those days. And he was about, I say he's about 20, 25 pounds overweight in the film. And he looks kind of, can we say homoerotic in appearance in that? Yeah, what would you say that?
well, that's exactly what it was. And you look at the fact that, in the film, Brando and his gang show up in this town. They're deciding whether they're going to leave or not. And then Lee Marvin's gang rolls into town. And it turns out that Lee Marvin and Brando knew each other in the past. They were very cloudy about what their relationship was. They were rivals at this point. But the first thing that Lee Marvin says to Brando is, Johnny, I miss you. I love you. I love you, Johnny. I've been looking all over for you, Johnny. I love you. And it's like, wait a minute here. And you start hearing about the quote queer interpretation of the film. Well, I'm looking at it really for the first time. I'm not a movie expert. I'm a pop culture writer and I'm a journalist when it comes to this. And I'm exploring as well. And I'm saying this isn't even subtext. This is text. I mean, these two guys, I love you. They get in a spat. Then they start rolling around and wrestling together. And then Brando punches Lee Marvin's character through a plate glass window of a bridal shop, and he lands between the bride and the groom. And then when he gets up, the bride is no longer in the window. It's just two. I'm saying, oh wow, this is too good to be true here. and you see also there was an artist named Tom of Finland, Taco Lakansen, a Finnish artist who drew very homoerotic pictures of men. He got his photos, he got his artwork published in the United States. They called him Tom of Finland. Before The Wild One came out, he did very nice pictures of guys, very, very beautiful men. When he saw The Wild One, everything changed. And every picture that he drew were of these guys in tight dungarees, black leather motorcycle jackets, cops, bikers. And it wound up changing the stereotype of the gay man from Hollywood had, the effeminate types that were, Franklin Pangborn, et cetera. But it changed the whole caricature, the whole stereotypical image of the gay man to the macho guy in the leather jacket, those leather men, like the guy in the Village People. And that he said it all came from seeing Brando in The Wild One.
Isn't that something? What
Yeah,
an icon.
wild stuff.
I think Wild Stuff is right. I think we should go back to the roots now. Go back to Nebraska. Talk about the alcoholic father and the alcoholic mother and the terrible childhood that Marlon withstood.
Yeah, Brando had it tough as a kid. I mean, the first thing he writes about in his own autobiography was remembering that, sleeping nude as a child with his 19-year-old nanny, a beautiful woman. He said her body was mine. She was mine, etc. And then when she left a year or two later to go off and get married, she abandoned him. And he said that just ruined him as far as women were concerned. He had two older sisters, and his father was a traveling salesman. He was an alcoholic. He was a philanderer. The mother was not too different than Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire. She was also an alcoholic who had dreams of theater. When they were living in Nebraska, she belonged to the community theater, and she acted. She even got one of her friends to convince her son to come join the acting troupe, young Henry Fonda. She got Henry Fonda into the acting business. Well, what happens is Brando's old man uproots the family, moves him to Illinois to some farmhouse outside Chicago, and her dreams are shattered. Brando remembers, getting the phone calls at night. Dad was out on the road. Mom was on the side of the road, drunk or in a bar, and he'd have to pick her up and bring her home. He had a really very tough upbringing. He had a hard time in school. What did Dad do? Shipped him off to a military academy as a teenage kid. And being, the military rule was not for Brando at all. But he thrived in it. He made friends. He stood out as a personality, wound up getting expelled. Which again led to, what do we do with young Marlon here, young Bud? What are we going to do with him? Well, let's ship him off to New York, where his sister's living in Greenwich Village. He was good at theater. He's good at acting. And then the rest is history. Went to New York, met Stella Adler, learned about society, learned about the world, and blew everybody's mind with the way he acted because nobody had seen this before. The way what brought Marlon Brando at first brought to the stage and then later brought to Hollywood.
No, believe it or not, I sat in Stella's class once and Uta Hagen's class once.
Yeah.
And I would say Stella's head and shoulders over. I learned more in 2 sessions with Stella than I did in about 10 with Uta. Both great. But he always said, Lee Strasberg, a fraud. Stella Adler, she was the one who taught me everything I know, didn't he? He did not care for Strasberg, but adored Adler.
That was the thing. I mean, when Adler became his teacher at the New School for Social Research in their theater department, she was from a Jewish acting, dynasty, royalty. Her father was the great actor Jacob Adler. Her brother was Luther Adler, the actor and director. And she came from the same group that Elia Kazan and Clifford Odets and probably Strasberg came from in the 1930s, that group theater where they were challenging, typical Broadway entertainment and wanted to bring in social relevance. That's where the method began. They all were looking toward a guy named Stanislavski, a director, actor Stanislavski in Russia, who invented the quote method. And the method said that when you approach a role, you take your memories and you bring your memories in and into that character and you inhabit the character from the inside. Well, Stella was the only one who actually had gone to Russia and studied under Stanislavski, and she found that he was a bit different. He actually had evolved a bit. He said, you don't need to use your past. You can use your imagination and bring other things into it. And she had this star pupil, Marlon Brando, and he attributed everything to her. Well, when the Actors Studio started, right before a Streetcar Named Desire opened on Broadway, and they handed it over to Lee Strasberg, suddenly he was the guru. And Brando was like, no, that's not that. I don't listen to those guys. I got it all from Stella. I'm not a method actor. Although he was actually the ultimate method actor, he just didn't call it that.
And he was great at pointing out fraudulent behavior. He couldn't wait to point the finger at a guy like Strasberg. I have a picture. Wait, let me think now of the Strasberg class, and I have the one picture I have of Brando sitting there, disinterested, like this, head in. Nobody can see this but you, but head in hand, and for the radio folks out there, I got my hand in my head in my hand here, and completely disinterested. That told the whole story. He did go to that class, but for the girls.
That's right. He'd say he went for the girls. So there you go.
He was very simple in his approach. He thought, I don't know if he thought it back then, because he was kind of a little bit more of a conformist in the younger days. I would still say that it wasn't until later that he started to put down the craft of acting. In the beginning, when he received his Academy Award for 1954's On the Waterfront, he went up there with the suit, the tie. He was very respectful in his speech, seemed to blend in very beautifully with everybody else. So I don't know if he was a rebel. I know he was a rebel, but I don't know if he was free to show that side of him just yet until later years. What do you think?
Well, when Brando was in A Streetcar Named Desire on Broadway in 1947, 48, everybody wanted him in Hollywood. His director of the play, Elia Kazan, kept trying to get him to come out to Hollywood. He wasn't interested in doing that. When he finally did, when Streetcar closed, it was time to go to Hollywood. Everybody said he's got to do what they all do. You're going to go to a studio. You're going to sign a contract. You're going to get into a multi-picture deal. You're going to work for a studio. Brando said, no, I'm not going to do that. And you also had to bow down to the gossip columnists, like when Hedda Hopper or the Ella Parsons came around. You had to go and you had to talk to them, and you had to grease the wheels, etc. Brando didn't. He laughed at them. He ignored them. He made up stories, etc. When he came out to Hollywood, it was for that film called The Men, where he played the paraplegic. It was a Stanley Kramer film, just like The Wild One was. And Stanley Kramer was known for his message movies, liberal message movies. When Brando came into Hollywood, he was known as the brat from Broadway. He was the mumbler. He was this big star. How's he going to fit into Hollywood? Well, he didn't arrive at LAX with flash bulbs and check into a bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Took a train out to the suburbs, showed up at his aunt's house where his grandmother was staying, So she had the extra bedroom. He bunked on the couch, slept on the couch there. They say that he brought with him, a couple of t-shirts and a pair of jeans. And then he checked himself into a VA hospital in Van Nuys for about a month. And he lived as a paraplegic among the other veterans. Some people thought that he actually was a paraplegic. He got used to life in a wheelchair. When they came to interview him, he got out of bed and rolled up in a wheelchair and explained how difficult it was. Actors didn't really do that back then. They do it all the time now. Robert De Niro will go rounds with a middleweight boxer, or Daniel Day-Lewis will lock himself in a room for 60 days to get ready to play In the Name of the Father. People will do that. And Brando started that. And so when he first showed up in a film, his acting was a huge contrast to the other actors in the scene. I mean, in this film, I think Jack Webb was one of the
Jack
actors,
Webb,
right?
Dragnet.
They're all great actors, but Brando stood out so much in the way he played. As a matter of fact, one of the people I spoke with in the book, Gary Shapiro, a film expert, said to me, in this film, Brando weeps and he cries at a situation. He goes, you never saw like a leading man, like Gary Cooper wouldn't sit and like cry like a baby in a film. And Brando did that. He wept, he cried. And I was like, who is this guy? Who is this actor? And right away they said, the gossip columnists, Hedda Hopper would say, Brando's disrespectful. He's a slob. He doesn't do what he's supposed to do. He doesn't show up at the El Macambo or Ciro's with a starlet. He's romancing secretaries instead. But this guy's got something. We don't think Hollywood's going to change him. And she says this early on, we think he's going to change Hollywood.
Well, he did. I remember Mama, Truckline Cafe. And when he did one of those plays, I'm not sure which one, people thought they took a guy off the street, walked on the stage, and just kind of, because he was so naturalistic. So, he's scratching, he's
Exactly,
maybe belching and doing all kinds of things that actors just did not do. You conform to a certain behavior mode when you got on stage, and you just didn't do that. But he let it all hang out. And man, I was so influenced by him. I said, I'm going to let it all hang out too. And he influenced so many actors in that sense where, naturalistic behavior became the norm, not the exception.
Yeah, he changed like what a leading man would be. I mean, before him, you had the Gary Coopers and the Clark Gables, and all you have to do is look at something like Mutiny on the Bounty, where he's playing Fletcher Christian, the guy who has a mutiny on this ship and takes over and takes the men off onto a desert island outside Tahiti. You look at how Clark Gable played the role, how Mel Gibson played the role. I don't know if Errol Flynn played the role, but look at an Errol Flynn type. You expect that person to be a swashbuckling hero. Well, Brando played him as sort of this foppish kind of, upper class guy and no one would play the role, think of playing the role like that. But he brought that to all his roles, where he's even in Sayonara playing a decorated Air Force officer. He stopped playing him as a macho flyboy. He's playing him as a guy who's always had this sort of questioning of his masculinity and where he was going next. And they say that thanks to Brando, you had leading men like Elvis, James Dean, even Paul Newman. And you go toward today, where a lot of the leading men were kids, Johnny Depp, Timothy Chalamet. These are all like people like in Brando's footsteps, along with great naturalistic actors like, Pacino and De Niro and Robert Duvall and people like that.
When you say Newman, he never could compare. And Newman was good, but not great, in my mind. I'm a tough marker. James Dean, 3 films, great stardom. I love James Dean, but, he died so young. And he always wanted to be Brando. And there was a rumor that those two would get together once in a while. Who knows? What about his bisexuality?
Well, the thing with Brando was he didn't bother to hide it. He had affairs with men. He had affairs with women. It's funny, looking into the relationship with James Dean, Brando looked at him more as a kid brother and felt sorry for the guy, because James Dean was in love with Marlon Brando. He loved him as an actor and he loved him as a man. And Brando would go to a party and there would be James Dean in the next room, kind of like watching him from the next room and kind of giving Brando the creeps. And, and Elia Kazan, who was directing James Dean in East of Eden, told Brando, you got to come over and you got to see this kid. He reminds me a lot of you. Well, Brando realized, here's James Dean. He's got a motorcycle. He's wearing a leather jacket. He's playing bongo drums. He realized, he said, wait a minute, this guy isn't in love with me. He's in love with my character from the Wild One. And he told me, he goes, kid, you got to be yourself. And I think you ought to see a psychiatrist. You ought to like get some therapy. I think you could use some help. And Brando always said that he thought that James Dean had a chance to become a good actor. And he really thought, as everyone did, that James Dean would have the time to do that. But instead, he lost him very early.
And that Porsche was mangled, and so was James Dean, unfortunately. Burt Kearns with me, fantastic book. Marlon Brando, Hollywood Rebel. You got to go catch it and read it. People don't read books anymore, but in this case, they're going to read this one. I guarantee. Did you put it out in a verbal book, or
not yet? No,
it's a hardcover?
It's an ebook and it's a hardcover right now, but we don't have the audio book yet.
Now, you notice how I say verbal book? That's how high tech I am.
Yeah, there you
this
go.
is Herb. And the thing is, Bert, I would say about Brando, he was an enigma. We know that. But I think that he was very doubtful of his impact. He would always put down the craft of acting, always say, don't follow me, I'll lead you into a ditch. This was a guy who thought what he was doing was insignificant, not a very big deal.
Brando would have rather, been a jazz drummer. He'd said he'd rather be a drummer than act. To him, it came so easy. And the thing with him was, I described him, I don't even think I mentioned it in the book, but from the time he was a kid, he was a rebel in search of a cause. And once he met Stella Adler, once he said he met Jewish people in New York who taught him about what was going on in Europe with the Holocaust and everything else and activism. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted each of his films to have some sort of social impact. And he gave up a lot of his career in the 1960s for activism. I looked at IMDb, the page where all the actors' credits, and Robert De Niro, who is 80 years old now, that's the age that Brando was when he died, has something like 150 credits and counting. Brando had 48. When you look at what Brando could have done, the number of movies he could have made, that he didn't because he was doing other things. He's marching on Washington. He's standing behind Martin Luther King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial when he's giving his "I Have a Dream" speech. He's at San Quentin protesting the death penalty. He's hanging with the Black Panthers in the 60s. He's doing environmental work. That's what really mattered to this guy. With all the faults that Brando had and his eccentricities, etc., he really wanted to make a difference, to the point where in 1970, when Paramount Pictures is casting The Godfather, the producers, Coppola, Al Ruddy, etc., wanted Brando. Studio didn't want him. He was known as box office poison. They wanted Ernest Borgnine or Sinatra or Laurence Olivier to
When I think
play
about
Don
those
Corleone.
choices, Bert, that they were considering is funny. I even heard, now he was very young at the time, I even heard they considered Robert Redford. But
They probably did. Whoever was
but
hot.
the names that you just said were right up there, and Sinatra famously called him Mumbles. You mentioned Mumbles before. Yeah. I think when he beat him out on the waterfront, he called him Mumbles. They gave the part to Mumbles. But in that case, I heard of the fabled meeting between Coppola and Brando in Brando's home, where he came down the stairs. I heard this, you correct me, with a robe, long hair, looking nothing really like the Godfather at that point. But he had this affectation that he did. I don't want to do it. Millions of people have done that better than I. But isn't this something that Coppola wanted him, and he was uninsurable? Nobody wanted him aside from the director. And finally, how did that come about? Maybe how did that come about where they actually got him? Well,
here you have the guy that was considered, one of the great actors. He took a screen test. They made him do a screen test.
That's right.
And that was where Brando, when he went and turned himself into Don Corleone, I spoke with Gray Fredrickson, who was one of the producers on the film. Gray had won the Oscar for Godfather Part 2 as producer of that film. And he said that, Brando was 47 years old and he was buff. He was in the best shape of his life at this time. You could see It was a movie called The Nightcomers, a little low budget thing that he had to make over in in the UK, where you could see how buff he was when he was in the movie Candy, where he played the guru. You could, just wearing a
That was a
loincloth.
weird one. That was a
Yeah,
weird.
that one he did for his pal. His pal was directing it, so he agreed to do it. But when Brando agreed to be in Candy, Richard Burton signed on. John Huston signed on. Ringo. Once Brando was there, then everybody rolled into the film. But anyway, with The Godfather, he was in great shape, and before their eyes, put the cotton balls in his cheeks. He wound up putting a dental plate in, changed his whole attitude, put a lot of padding around him, and he turned himself into Don Corleone. And the rest is history as far as that film's concerned, as far as cinema is concerned.
He said he compared that character to a bulldog. He thought of that whole persona as a bulldog. But it's the scene that stays with me, but many do. And again, that's not even my favorite Brando film, because for some reason it became so stereotypical. I'm Italian, so I have it up to here with all the mob movies. Sometimes that was the best of its kind. I'll give you that, but it still wasn't my favorite. But what a wonderful film, no doubt about it. But the scene when he shook Act Like a Man and he slapped the singer,
Al Martino.
that was one that sticks in my mind, because he's improvising all this stuff. That this stuff is not written in stone. And in the moment, there we go, the moment he's doing this thing, it was brilliant. He had brilliant moments, but he wasn't in that film frame by frame as much as Jimmy Caan or Al Pacino. He wasn't in there quite as much, though he stole the whole thing, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. About 30 years ago, a writing partner of mine, we had a deal to write Al Martino's biopic, and so we spent a lot of time with Al Martino writing a movie about his life. And he told us about the whole Godfather situation. Martino played Johnny Fontaine, the singer, and Coppola did not want him because he wasn't an actor. He never acted before. Well, he had, as far as Martino told the story, he had loaned some money to the producers, made a deal, et cetera, beforehand. They said, if you loan us this money, we'll give you a part of the film. And so Coppola was totally ignoring Al Martino before that scene. And he's waiting to go on, and he hears Coppola talking to Brando, and Brando says, "What is it? Who is Martino? He's not an actor. I have to do a scene with Al Martino." And he said, I hope the guy should get drunk. So Martino heard this and said he left the set, went around the corner to a liquor store, came back with a bottle of whiskey, sat down at the Don's desk to do that scene, put the whiskey down and said, "Mr. Brando, I heard what you said. You take the first shot and I'll drink from there." And they both drank together, and Brando took care of him through the scene and really scared him with the whole, "You got to be a man."
He shook him and slapped him around.
Yeah.
It was pretty darn good. It seems so extemporaneous. I said, that's got to be happening in the moment. But I'm going to name a film. We'll do something else, but I want to do this first. If you'll play with this game with me, I'm going to name a film. You give me your first impression. My favorite film. It's hard. Favorites are so silly. Why do I do that? But I'll give you one that always struck me: The Young Lions.
Brando is playing a Nazi officer, and he insisted before he took the role that that person had to not be a stereotypical Nazi officer. He had to have heart. He had to be a Brando character. So right away, you had a sympathetic Nazi in this film, really, which you would not have seen before.
Yeah, that was a beautiful performance, I thought.
Yeah.
And
also performance where I noticed watching it again recently, Brando was criticized, but this was a real technique of his of not learning his lines beforehand. He wanted them written up on cue cards. When he did the scene in On the Waterfront, where I could have been a contender in the back of the cab, you see him looking up. He's got lines written above him because he wanted some realism. He wanted to hear the line, think for a second before he said it, not just spout it out and recite it. In the Young Lions, I noticed a couple of scenes where you could see him stopping and looking off before he says his lines. That was where I first noticed it.
You could see him looking up all through his career, looking over there, looking there. And I always thought it was some kind of I used to do it when I was 20 years old to try to be like him. because that's the way I felt. Why is he? Oh, look at how cool that looks when he looks off in the distance over the top of the guy he's playing against, over the top of his head. But he's actually looking at the lines and the cue cards. That's hilarious. The Fugitive Kind.
Wow, there he is. What was it? He was a snakeskin.
That's right. You're good because I'm just throwing things at you cold.
He wore that snakeskin jacket that Nick Cage wore in.
That's right.
In the Nick Cage movie. That was with Anna Magnani, right? And that was another another Tennessee Williams play that was turned into a film where Brando plays the drifter and gets involved with Newman's wife, Joanne Woodward, is in that.
Joanne Woodward
playing the small town girl. Another that's an overlooked film of Brando's, but again, another Elia Kazan movie.
No, that wasn't. That was
Lumet, Sidney Lumet.
Yes, Sidney Lumet. That's right. And okay. Here's one more popular, more well known, On the Waterfront.
Well, there's Brando at his peak. That was the film that got him his first Academy Award as Best Actor. That was his reunion with Elia Kazan, who directed him to greatness in A Streetcar Named Desire on Broadway, directed him in A Streetcar on Film, directed him in Viva Zapata. But by the time they were going to reunite for On the Waterfront, Brando didn't want to do the film because Elia Kazan had testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee and named names of people who he said had, were now or had ever been communists. He's named names of people that he worked with back in the 1930s in the group theater. And Brando knew these people and couldn't believe that, he knew they were hurt by what he had done. And he didn't want to work with the guy. He at this time, Brando was relying a lot on his psychiatrist, Dr. Bella Middleman in Manhattan. And Middleman and Stella Adler told him, look, if you want to get past a lot of your issues, you got to learn to forgive and you got to move forward. And you also have to do this for your career. This is a great role. You should do it. Meanwhile, the producer, Sam Spiegel, wasn't sure if they were getting Brando. So he signed Frank Sinatra for the role. Sinatra signed a contract, had a deal to do the role. And so that's another reason why Sinatra didn't like Marlon Brando. So when Brando did sign to do a streetcar, did sign to do On the Waterfront in Hoboken, New Jersey, he had it put in his contract that he would leave the set every day at 4 o'clock so he could go across the river to Manhattan and get back on a psychiatrist's couch. And that's, so he made that sort of under a bit of stress and under a bit of rebellion. But God, just that scene where Eva Marie Saint drops the glove in the playground there, and the two of them is just tremendous film.
Well, they said it was a love story, not a boxing movie, not a tale about a former boxer and the mob, so on and so forth. It was more Eva Saint, who's still with us. She's 100,000 years old. I think she's 99. And it's funny. Eva Saint was older than he was in that film, I think by a year. Yeah. And up on the roof with the pigeons were classic stuff, but that glove, that was in the moment, kind of not planned, dropped it. They would usually cut there, but Kazan chose to continue filming. And what did Brando do? Put it on his hand to be close, to feel close to Eva Saint. You can't get any better. Now, you told that story about the psychiatrist. You're so right. But Steiger used to complain in the back of the cab. That scene was a very difficult scene to complete. And Steiger said, he left me cold. 4 o'clock, he went off to see the shrink. I had to do the scene with the script guy. Did you hear about that?
That's not cool.
Yeah, Steiger said, he said, and Steiger was always very indignant about that. He said, Mr. Brando he always said, Mr. Brando had to go. He had to leave. So I'm a pretty good actor. He always said this. It always struck me. I'm a pretty good, I got some talent myself. And I did the scene with the script boy. I had to do what I had to do, that kind of thing. But that scene was the most iconic scene in the whole film. What did you think of that scene? And tell me about the little details that you learned from that scene.
Well, I mean, again, that summed everything up. The relationship between, Brando and his brother, Terry Malloy, and the world he was living in. And again, that was the scene that won him the Oscar. I mean, you could that was actors don't do that, don't give so much of themselves in a role, and you can see that he did. Where it was you, Charlie. I could have been contender. You were supposed to watch out for me, and you didn't. That's a heartbreaking scene. It was tremendous.
And speak about giving too much of yourself. Last Tango in Paris, he said, "I'll never do it again. I'll never disclose all this hard, this past that I had," because everything he said in that film was about his real life.
I saw that picture when I was a kid, in 1972. I was
Rated
probably,
X, by the way.
yeah, I was probably 17 years old. And that's why you're going to see it. Oh, wow, this has got sex movie in it, et cetera. And everybody talked about the butter scene, et cetera. And I saw the film, and then I watch it again 50 years later when I'm writing this book. And I'm saying, how could I ever have thought I could understand what was going on in this picture? It was devastating. I walked around for like 2 days after watching this, going, "Oh my God!" The scene of him, which has become very controversial now because of the book that came out about the actress Maria Schneider, where he sodomizes her with the butter, and apparently he and the director didn't let her know that scene was going to happen. It was simulated, but they say that it really had an effect on her. That wasn't the heavy scene of the film. I mean, this is a film about a middle-aged man and a young woman who meet at an empty apartment that they're both looking to see if they want to rent, and they have an anonymous sexual relationship where they don't even know each other's names. And the reason is that Brando's character, his wife, has just committed suicide, and he's in this deep stage of grief and self-hatred and regret. And the ultimate scene is when he returns to the hotel that his wife was running, where her body is laid out, and he speaks to the corpse of his wife and just lets out everything about their past and his regrets. And it's a devastating scene. That I think is his greatest acting role. And part of the reason it was so great was that he said that the director, Bertolucci, really didn't speak English. And he told Brando, improvise these scenes. And he improvised a lot of the stuff. And he brought a lot of his own life and his own past about his mother and about his childhood that he never wanted to do. And he did that. And he got another Academy Award nomination for it, but it was too much. He said, I'm never gonna give myself like I did into this film." And what did he do? He went and he did Superman. And he never did that again. Everything after that were these, basically, apart from Apocalypse Now, were basically cameo roles in films that he just had fun with.
Believe it or not, I've never seen Apocalypse Now, excuse me, from start to finish. For whatever reason, I just never sat through it. And to me, he held up the whole filming of that movie. He everything was riding on him. An exorbitant amount of money he wanted, and he showed up so much obese and with a bald head, and really devastated everybody. And that whole set, that whole filming was cursed from the start. I think somebody had a heart attack.
Martin Sheen.
Yes, Martin Sheen had a heart attack, and they filmed in terrible conditions. Well, what were your impressions of that film?
Well, I mean, again, that wasn't his greatest film. It was, it's an interesting film. Coppola's done a couple of different versions of it. Now there's a couple of cuts you can watch that are different from the original. I spoke again to Gray Fredrickson, who was a producer on Apocalypse, and he said, they're in the Philippines, ready to shoot. Brando shows up, and he goes, "He's 300 pounds, and he's got a shaved head. What are we gonna do here?" And although there are now people that look back at Brando's journals and writings and claim otherwise, but according to Gray, he hadn't read the novella Heart of Darkness that it was based on, and Coppola had to go and sit with him every morning and read it to him and explain to him what the role was. And Brando's also taking credit for the fact that his character was always in the shadows, and it was sort of like the shark in Jaws. He kind of came out once in a while, and you saw him. Gray said, no, we had to because he was so huge. We had to find a way to cover him so you couldn't see him. That was a film that I think some hipsters liked back in the 70s, and it had its moments, but I think the whole Brando part in it was just
Yeah, I thought it was unsteady. I didn't really. That's
yeah
why I never stayed with it. And I'm the
yeah.
biggest Brando guy next to you, the biggest Brando guy there was. And I couldn't stay with it for whatever reason. I wasn't in the mood every time I tried to watch the film. We should
Well,
talk about his activism.
yeah.
And we'll talk about Wally Cox, an unlikely best friend that a guy like Brando would ever have. But let's first talk about the activism. Well,
Well,
if he had no cause, he felt no reason to even pursue anything. That was his main business. I think that's what he was. He thought that that's what he was here for. His celebrity was made so he can make a difference.
there was a reason for it. And it's funny, you mentioned some of his early plays. I remember Mama and Truckline Cafe, etc. After he did that, when he started getting a name on Broadway, he was offered a role in a Eugene O'Neill play, The Iceman Cometh,
Hmm.
one of the great works of the 20th century literature. Brando read it. He said he fell asleep in the first act. He thought it was too wordy and it bored him. He didn't want to do it. Instead, he took a role in a play that was being directed by Stella Adler's brother called A Flag is Born. And this was a propaganda play created by a group called the American League for a Free Palestine. And this was a group that was trying to raise money to get the displaced Jews from Europe from World War II to rent a boat and help them get over to this new homeland they were creating in Palestine called Israel. And part of the money was going to that, and some of the money was going for guns for a group called the Irgun, which was run by Menachem Begin. They were the militant group, the terrorists who were trying to convince Britain, which was administering the region at the time, to allow Israel to be formed. So Brando starred in this play. He was the only non-Jew in the play. He was the star of the play, and he was only getting scale. And when the run was over, he had to find some work because he couldn't afford his rent. But instead, he went and he took a role as a speaker for this group and went on the road with another actor and gave lectures around the country at synagogues and Jewish groups to raise money for this group. And this was the time he's on a bus going around the country and he's seeing segregation for the first time. He's seeing, the Deep South. He's seeing Washington, D.C. There's segregation in our nation's capital. And he only wanted more to do things that mattered. And so I never knew that it went back that far, that Marlon Brando actually helped create the state of Israel, which is pretty wild.
And ironically, he was accused of anti-Semitism later in his life for some remarks he made. Did you hear about that?
Right, later in his life, he would say, yes, the Jews run Hollywood, etc.
That's it.
Yeah, and the way he spoke of, quote, the Jews, he wrote it in his book as well, where he said, I met Jewish people for the first time when he came to Greenwich Village in the 40s when he was a kid, when the Adler family sort of took him in. He met Jewish people, and he was embraced by this culture for the first time, where they talked about politics and theater and the arts, and he was just overwhelmed by it, where he just he loved these people very much. Later in his life, as he became more eccentric, what can you say about a lot of things that Brando did?
And you say eccentric. I wonder if he wasn't suffering from Alzheimer's or perhaps dementia in the later years, because he acted so strangely that you would think something's wrong. My mother suffers, and I know my mother. I see glimpses of my mother from way back, but I see that disease really taking hold. You got to wonder about something like that. How about the civil rights, the marches he participated in?
Yeah, I mean, when Brando first started his movie company, everybody by the 1950s, if you were a big actor, you got your own production company. He started his production company, Pennebaker Films, which is named for his mother's maiden name. He wanted, again, to make films that mattered. The first thing he wanted to do was to address the caste system in India. He wanted, because he learned about that and couldn't believe it, and wanted to do stuff about the third world. And then he wanted to make a film about Native Americans. He wound up doing Western One-Eyed Jacks, which really didn't address that. But he stated that, right from the beginning. His first activism, where he was first seen out there putting his face in the papers and his neck on the line, was against the death penalty. There was an inmate named Carroll Chessman. He was known as the most famous death row inmate in the country. He was sentenced to death for kidnapping and rape. He never killed anyone, and he had written books. They did movies about him. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He'd survived, 8 stays of execution, and Brando, at the final time that he was about to be executed, Brando was there at San Quentin amid all the activists and the Quakers and the proto hippies that were there, dressed in his suit, etc., and spoke to the crowd because he was against the death penalty. And of course, what happened? The media, the very conservative gossip media and entertainment media, laughed at him, made fun of him. He's, what a joke. Brando's only doing it for publicity. He's only doing it because he wants to make a movie, etc. And he was like the first of the actors to put themselves out there for a cause. And, just like John Lennon would do that, allow himself to be laughed at and be ridiculed, knowing that it was for something greater. From there, he went on to the civil rights, the civil rights movement, where he marched for Martin Luther King. He marched alongside Martin Luther King. He was there again on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial when King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. Brando through the 60s saw that dream fade away with riots and the assassination of King, etc. He made a film in 1969 called Queimada, later called Burn, where he played a foreign agent from Britain who goes to the Caribbean to start a revolution so they could take over the take over the sugar trade. It was set in the 1850s, and Brando really wanted to find a way to connect that film to what was going on in America at the time, with the cities burning in the summer, etc. He started hanging out with the Black Panthers. So next thing you know, so Brando's gone from Martin Luther King to Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver. Amazing. And then, as this is all going on, he's participating in demonstrations for Native Americans, speaking in Washington on behalf of Native American rights, etc. So he really put his career aside through the 60s, only took films to pay for some of his wives and some of his custody battles. He's paying for that. He's also paying to finance his activities as well.
And you mentioned all this, and I realize we need a part 2 because we can't get to everything. When you get a guy so complex, not you, Burt, but Marlon, but you got to keep going. But I got a few more minutes to squeeze you into the radio. See, the whole thing, the radio has a time constraint, but the other doesn't. So I wanted personal tragedy. His daughter and the shooting and Christian Brando and the whole works. Talk about that for a moment.
Well, here you had Brando. At the time this happened, I was working in what was known as tabloid television, TV show, Current Affair back then.
Oh, you were working for them? Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was helping run a Current Affair.
I remember that very well.
Yeah, later went on to came out to LA with Hard Copy. We took over that show. But at this time, there was a hierarchy of celebrity that when we started covering Hollywood. You had Madonna, you had Jack Nicholson, you had at the very, Elizabeth Taylor was up there. And then at the very top, you had Marlon Brando, this figure who lived up on top of Mulholland Drive, who rarely came out. He was a mysterious figure that once in a while there'd be sightings of him. Well, then you get the call that there is a shooting in his living room. His son, Christian, who had been in the papers since he was born, basically because of custody battles, the very public custody battles that Brando had with his first wife, Anna Cashby, where Christian was kidnapped and moved around, etc., and had a very tough life. Christian had shot to death the lover of his half-sister in Marlon Brando's TV room while Brando was in bed. So the next thing you know, Brando, who is this figure who is rarely seen, is suddenly in the spotlight. And I remember the first time at the court hearing where we heard that Brando was going to be at the court. I was in New York. My producer reporter was in LA. And I said, "You got Marlon Brando there. If Marlon Brando comes out, you got to get him to talk. You got to see what you could do." Anyway, when the court was over that day, Brando and his lawyer, Robert Shapiro at the time, they come out and there's a bank of microphones and Brando stands there and you've got Brando standing in front of a wall of cameramen and reporters. Nobody said anything. They're just like staring at him. And I'm watching this on a feed and I'm going, you've literally got the great white whale and nobody's asking him a question. He might never come out again. Well,
Right.
I got on the phone with the reporter and I'm sending you, in those days, I'm faxing you a list of questions. If Brando if we ever have the luck that he's going to come out again and speak to the press, these are the questions you've got to, ask him or shout at him. Well, Brando came out every day after court for that hearing. And he spoke to the press and he worked the press. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, Cheyenne, his daughter, whose lover had been killed, they shipped her back to Tahiti so she wouldn't have to testify. And Brando showed his mastery at working the media. Christian Brando got off with a relatively light sentence for manslaughter. I think he served about 4 years as opposed to, being up for first-degree murder. And Brando showed that, he still had it then. And then, of course, from then, you mentioned whether or not he had any kind of mental difficulties. As he went on through the 90s, he had his friendships with Elizabeth Taylor and Michael Jackson, et cetera, and, became part of, the tabloid culture that he'd stayed away from for so long.
And Cheyenne not soon after, but she did end up committing suicide tragically. Yeah. And Christian Brando, he's passed away also. Well, we'll have to wait to get to Wally Cox, the strangest relationship that there ever was on the planet. And because who did he want to be buried next to her, his ashes meshed with? Wally Cox. Cox. Burt Kearns, Marlon Brando, Hollywood Rebel is a must-buy. Go to Amazon. Where can we get that book?
It's available, hopefully, wherever books are sold. We have a website, marlonbrandobook.com, where you can order signed copies. But it's on all the places, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc.
Well, it's something. It's been a treat, and it's been everything I thought it would be. This interview, and thank you so much. And again, if you're up for part 2, we'll do part 2 in a week or two.
There's lots to talk about. I got to tell you the Wally Cox story. Underdog is here.
I was going to say Underdog and Mr. Peepers?
Mr. Peepers.
Oh, my goodness. Burt, I appreciate it. Thank you.
So do I. Thanks so much.
Okay.